Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So today we're back on this mission or adventure that Diotima sent us on in the symposium when she told Socrates that what all humans desire is simply the good. We wondered how this could be true, but before we try to answer that, we thought we should investigate what the good means for Plato, and we found out that in the Republic, he talks about it being the principle or cause of both knowing and the things that are known. You could say the subjective and the objective, the inner and the outer worlds. So that the good, as Socrates says at one point, is even in a way beyond being, the cause of all beings, or as I say in the title of this video, hyper-real, which I gather has certain specific meanings in other contexts, but to me the term just seemed that it would fit quite well to my purpose here, talking about the Platonic good. To most of us, this idea of the good being the ultimate principle is going to sound kind of strange and confusing, I think, too. So we found it a bit frustrating to discover that Plato doesn't give us, in any of his writings, a clear or direct explanation of why he believes this about the good. Instead, as we saw, Socrates in the Republic just tells Glaucon that he's not feeling up to the task at the moment. So it's no surprise that modern scholars have done an enormous amount of speculating about what Plato could have had in mind here. This sea of interpretations was helpfully grouped into four basic categories in a 2001 book by an Italian scholar, Francesco Fronterotta. And his grouping of interpretations is cited in a 2020 book on Plato by U of T professor Lloyd Gerson. So it seems it's been meeting with at least a certain amount of acceptance in the scholarly community, this grouping. I thought I'd go through it today, these groups of interpretations, because as I'll explain a little later in this video, pondering these hypotheses about the hyper-real, as I call them, can be consciousness expanding in a way that I believe tends to set the psyche on a course toward deep hope, or as this might be expressed today, positivity. The first interpretation on Fronterotta's list is that Plato's good is actually the supreme God, possibly the creator God, the demiurge or craftsman, mentioned in another Platonic dialogue, the Timaeus. The English Victorian era scholar R.L. Nettleship, who died, by the way, in the Alps trying to climb Mont Blanc, I think in the 1890s, wrote that Plato's basically just using different vocabularies here to convey the same idea. He says, in the Timaeus, the supreme power in the universe is described in a personal way, as a god, he means. In the Republic, it is described in what we call an abstract way, as the good. And it's worth noting in this context that in this passage in the Republic that we've been talking about, Plato again uses this term demiurgos, the craftsman. He seems to be talking about a creator god. Anyway, the second possibility Fronterotta cites, which he says is the most popular among scholars, is that the good is the ontological or meta-ontological cause of the ideas and therefore of everything. Okay, so what does this fancy language mean? N.P. White, in his 1979 companion to Plato's Republic, breaks it down fairly clearly, I think. If you've made it through this series so far, I imagine you're familiar with the concept of the Platonic form, these universal ideas of things that are, for Plato, not just in our heads, but fully real, more real for Plato than the sensible world around us. So for Plato, the ideal form of something is that thing, well, ideally, or as White puts it, quote, fully and without defect. This is why the good, in this view, is the principle of human knowledge. The Platonic form of something is its ideal exemplar. So, quote, to understand what each form is, one would have to understand the notion of goodness, because one would have to understand what it is for the form of something, of f, he uses this variable f, what it is for the form of f to be a good f in this sense. For a similar reason, the good is the principle of the forms themselves. The form of forms, you might say. To quote White again, if to be the form of f is to be unqualifiedly f, and in that sense a good f, like this ideal exemplar, then the being of the form can reasonably enough be thought of as involving and in a sense made possible by the good. So I think kind of another way of saying that really is that the things of our world are manifestations or shinings forth of their ideal and perfect exemplars. And this is actually the root meaning of the word idea in Greek, where we get the English word idea. And Plato uses idea in Greek means something glimpsed. So the ideas or forms are glimpses of perfection, glimpses of the good in that sense. Everything around us, in a way, allows a potential glimpse of absolute perfection or the absolute good, this hyper-reality. So that's the second and most common, according to Fronterata, guess among modern scholars of what Plato had in mind when he described the good as the ultimate principle or cause. The third is what Fronterata calls the teleological or axiological interpretation. And helpfully for us, it's put very concisely by the 19th and 20th century American scholar Paul Shorey in the notes that accompany his translation of the Republic, published almost a century ago in 1930. And I've been citing this translation often, even though it's a tad archaic, partly because it's the one used by the Perseus Digital Library, which is an amazing free online resource that contains tons of texts in their original languages with translations, excuse me, and often very good notes. Anyway, here's what Shorey says about this passage that most scholars have found so baffling. He says, the meaning is clear. We really understand and know anything only when we apprehend its purpose, the aspect of the good that it reveals. Not only do we understand a thing when we know its purpose, but a purpose in some mind is the chief cause of its existence. God's mind for the universe, man's mind for political institutions. This, being the only interpretation that makes sense of the passage, is presumably more or less consciously Plato's meaning. So one interesting thing about Shorey's interpretation is that he doesn't seem to believe Plato necessarily had an explanation that he had actually worked out on a conscious level. Anyway, this third interpretation, though it seemed obvious to Shorey, is, I think, not so easy for us in the modern era to get our heads around. Many of us are accustomed to see scientific explanation as the default one, and basically the truest one. But science, of course, is indifferent to considerations of goodness, and so we can be accustomed to thinking of goodness or purpose, teleology, not to mention the concept of divinity, as a human construct, and not actually in the order of things. Yet, I think it's fair to say we, perhaps in science even most of all, assume rationality in the universe. That ultimately everything has an explanation, happens for a reason, even if it doesn't happen for a purpose. In this sense, everything works out right, I think you could say. Maybe not for the individual components of the universe and not all the time, but for the universe as a whole, everything works out right, and in that sense happens for the best. Events are the result of the universe working out, in a way, its own infinitely complicated and infinitely perfect calculations. Everything that happens is then, in a way, perfect. Some might say against this that quantum mechanics, for example, proves there's randomness in the universe, but others, of course, argue that it shows we're just not yet capable of determining the causes of motion on this small a scale, the subatomic level. And generally, I think if we actually believed randomness was in the fabric of reality, we'd probably go insane. Because I think every moment of our inner lives basically presupposes that it's not. Actually, I wonder if that's basically what panic is, this sort of uniquely human phenomenon, I think. I mean, animals can be terrified and out of control, of course, but I don't think in humans, panic is this sort of state of being out of control that's a lapse from our ordinary state. And I wonder if it begins in a thought, perhaps below the threshold of consciousness. In other words, a thought that maybe happens too quickly for us to remember it later, that the universe is fundamentally irrational, which initiates a kind of feedback loop with our fight or flight response. Anyway, I'm digressing quite a bit here, but basically what I'm trying to say is that it's perhaps not all that hard for us to hold in our minds that perfection or the good seems to be the principle here, in that for the universe as a whole, everything works out infinitely well. That is to say, for an infinite good in a certain way. I don't know about you, but I think all this speculation about what Plato had in mind is really kind of trippy. But it's a trippiness of the best kind. I think to think about these things, as I'm fond of saying in this series, can expand our consciousness in a life-enriching way. I believe that the best metaphysics, like the best art, must involve us, even if just momentarily, in some sort of altered state of consciousness. But the great advantage of philosophy over other means of consciousness expansion, I think, is that it's most communicable because it's conveyed in universal terms rather than by means of images and sensations, which seems to me to be the medium through which these altered states of consciousness tend to operate. And because of that, it's demonstrable. And I think this is important because while on the one hand, there's something playful about philosophy. I mean, this stuff isn't going to help in any way that I can conceive, help one get a job or achieve anything practical. In one sense, it's a pure play of the mind. I also believe, as I've said many times before, that in Plato's teaching on love and desire, there's a wellspring of deep hope and real wisdom for living life. So thinking about these different possible solutions to the mystery Plato has confronted us with here, even though they may seem quite abstract, isn't just an academic exercise. It is no ordinary matter that we are discussing, but the right conduct of life, says Socrates about justice in the Republic. And I think that's true with our discussion of the good as well. The other thing I want to say about these interpretations is that I don't believe they're mutually exclusive. And I think many of the scholars who put them forth believe this also. In fact, sometimes the same scholar, will offer more than one of them as potential answers to the riddle that Plato has posed us. He himself may have had all of them in mind and maybe more besides, and we saw that Shorey at least believed that Plato might not even have had a worked out solution in his mind at all, but rather that he might have been trying to voice something maybe he felt he had a kind of intuitive knowledge of. I'm guessing that's what Shorey was thinking. By the way, since I mentioned Paul Shorey, this might not be a bad time to say a bit more about him. I think not a bad idea, partly because he's an interesting character, as a lot of these Plato scholars have been, but partly also because he was quite influential on the course Plato's scholarship took in the 20th century, and I think continues to be pretty influential. Wikipedia helpfully reminds us he's not to be confused with the comedian Pauly Shore. Anyway, he was born in Iowa back in 1857, which must have, I think, had an almost frontier feeling at the time. I read also in Wikipedia that it had been only 24 years earlier that the territory had been opened up to settlers. According to a bio of Shorey in the Rutgers database of classical scholars, Shorey remembered reading Darwin's Origin of Species to his mother at age 9. That work was published in 1959, by the way, when he would have been 2. He studied law at Harvard and worked at his father's law firm for a while, but then decided he was more interested in scholarship, and over the next several years studied classics, especially Plato, at 4 different European universities. Returning to the US, he taught at Bryn Mawr, where, according to the Rutgers database bio, he was, quote, impressing and terrifying students with his vast recall of the poetry of Greek, Latin, French, and English. And by the way, as we all know, you have to be a bit careful with Wikipedia because the Wikipedia article on Paul Shorey that I looked at claims an article published when he died in 1934 reported that Shorey knew the entire Iliad by heart. And actually, you see this claim reported elsewhere. But when you check the article out yourself, the article that the Wikipedia article cites, when you check it out, you see that it actually says no such thing, although it is an interesting article. It certainly praises Shorey as a genius, one who could understand ancient Greek read aloud as easily as he could understand English. One of the things he's known for is arguing against a view of Plato. It was popular among German scholars at the time that the philosopher's views evolved significantly over his lifespan. Though, as we'll see, he's also known for something else that's important to us. Generally, Shorey seems to have been pretty polemical toward not just German scholarship, but even Germany as a country. At least he argued early on for the United States to enter World War I. One of his works, to again quote the Rutgers biography, quote, is marred by outbursts of irritation aimed at German culture, philosophy, and scholarship, unquote. According to that bio, Shorey was a conservative and didn't like the progressive culture that he saw coming out of Germany at the time. Progressivism we can see, for example, in the culture of the post-World War I Weimar Republic. It's kind of interesting to note that another prominent University of Chicago Plato scholar and conservative, Alan Bloom, seems to associate 60s radicalism in his Closing of the American Mind with the culture of the Weimar era. And of course, there were a lot in Germany who didn't like this progressivism either, as became increasingly clear with the election of the Nazi party to power the year before Shorey died. Anyway, Shorey seems to have been very warmly remembered by his colleagues and students for his intellect, but not just for that. He seems to have been a beloved teacher, and in fact, one of his students ended up marrying him. A professor who had studied under Shorey recalled in another article published after his death, I must tell you that we students were a bit afraid of him at first. He seemed remote from us in the quality and degree of his genius. We admired him, as it were, at a distance. It took time for us to realize that in his feeling for his students, he was a very human being indeed, and that he craved from us not so much our high respect as our companionship, our fellowship. I remember well, in the days of our early acquaintance, going skating with him in Jackson Park. That's in Chicago. I was pleased and flattered that he should condescend to disport himself with me, but I was not entirely comfortable. I could not adjust myself to a world authority on Plato skimming over the ice like any boy. In fact, he was, as I later came to know, like any boy. I cannot forget how startled I was when one day he asked me to drop the doctor and the professor and address him as one friend to another. It was very hard to do. It seemed like slapping him on the back when I felt it appropriate always to be sitting at his feet. So Shorey died in 1934, teaching almost to the very last. He was, as I said, enormously influential on Plato scholarship in North America, not just through his publications, but his teaching, of course. And as tends to happen, this line of influence continued as those he taught became teachers in turn, and as those they taught became teachers, and so on. It's remarkable, kind of, how this chain can work. You might be familiar, for example, with this book, Plato at the Googleplex, which came out in 2014. It was written by Rebecca Goldstein, a scholar who also happens to be the wife of Steven Pinker, whom I've mentioned earlier in this series. Anyway, her lineage as an heir to teaching on Plato can be traced back by means of this chain of teachers and students all the way back to Paul Shorey. Now, there's one more thing about Paul Shorey that I need to mention, because it'll be quite significant for us in our mission. Also, it might occur to you that I mentioned this view that there are basically four main interpretations of Plato's assertion that the good is the principle of everything, and that I've gone over only three. Well, there's a fourth one, which Shorey mentions in the note I mentioned above. He summarily rejects it as, quote, quite irrelevant, unquote. I actually dare to venture, and I'm not alone in this, that the brilliant Shorey was wrong here. Quite wrong, actually. I think the fourth one is at once the most mind-blowing of all these interpretations. Likely also the explanation of the good that was closest to Plato's heart, and of supreme importance for us as we try to make sense of his teaching on love and desire, as we try and I hope succeed to some extent. That crucial and very controversial fourth interpretation is what I'll be starting to look at next time. Until then, thanks for watching.